Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. So let's continue Sophie's world. The final cause. Before we leave the subject of all living and dead things having a form that says something about their potential action, I must add that Aristotle had a remarkable view of causality in nature. Today when we talk about the cause of anything, we mean how it came to happen. The window pane was smashed because Peter hurled a stone through it. A shoe is made because the shoemaker sews pieces of leather together, but Aristotle held that there were different types of cause in nature. Altogether, he named 4 different causes. It is important to understand what he meant by what he called the final cause. In the case of window smashing, it is quite reasonable to ask why Peter threw the stone. We are thus asking what his purpose was. There can be no doubt that purpose played a role, also, in the matter of the shoe being made. But Aristotle also took into account a similar purpose when considering the purely lifeless processes in nature. Here's an example. Why does it rain, Sophie? You have probably learned at school that it rains because the moisture in the clouds cools and condenses into raindrops that are drawn to the earth by the force of gravity. Aristotle would have nodded in agreement. But he would have added that so far you have only mentioned 3 of the causes. The material cause is that the moisture, the clouds, was there at the precise moment when the air cooled. The efficient cause is that the moisture cools, and the formal cause is that the form, or nature of the water, is to fall to the earth. But if you stop there, Aristotle would add that it rains because plants and animals need rainwater in order to grow. This he called the final cause. Aristotle assigns the raindrops a life task or purpose. We would probably turn the whole thing upside down and say that plants grow because they find moisture. You can see the difference, can't you, Sophie? Aristotle believed that there is a purpose behind everything in nature. It rains so that plants can grow, oranges and grapes grow so that people can eat them. That is not the nature of scientific reasoning today. We say that food and water are necessary conditions of life for man and beast. Had we not had these conditions, we would not have existed. But it is not the purpose of water or oranges to be food for us. In the question of causality, then, we are tempted to say that Aristotle was wrong. But let us not be too hasty. Many people believe that God created the world as it is so that all his creatures could live in it. Viewed in this way, it can naturally be claimed that there is water in the rivers because animals and humans need water to live. But now we are talking about God's purpose. The raindrops and the waters of the river have no interest in our welfare. Logic. The distinction between form and substance plays an important part in Aristotle's explanation of the way we discern things in the world. When we discern things, we classify them in various groups or categories. I see a horse, then I see another horse, and another. The horses are not exactly alike, but they have something in common, and this common something is the horse's form. Whatever might be distinctive or individual belongs to the horse's substance. So we go around pigeonholing everything. We put cows in cow sheds, horses in stables, pigs in pigsties, and chickens in chicken coops. The same happens when Sophie Amundsen tidies up her room. She puts her books on the bookshelf, her school books in her school bag, and her magazines in the drawer. Then she folds her clothes neatly and puts them in the closet. Underwear on one shelf, sweaters on another, and socks in a drawer on their own. Notice that we do the same thing in our minds. We distinguish between things made of stone, things made of wool, and things made of rubber. We distinguish between things that are alive or dead, and we distinguish between vegetable, animal, and human. Do you see, Sophie? Aristotle wanted to do a thorough clearing up in nature's room. He tried to show that everything in nature belongs to different categories and subcategories. Hermes is a live creature, more specifically an animal, more specifically a vertebrate, more specifically a mammal, more specifically a dog, more specifically a Labrador, more specifically a male Labrador. Go into your room, Sophie. Pick up something, anything, from the floor. Whatever you take, you will find that what you are holding belongs to a higher category. The day you see something you are unable to classify, you will get a shock. If, for example, you discover a small whatsit, and you can't really say whether it is animal, vegetable, or mineral, I don't think you would dare touch it. Saying animal, vegetable, and mineral reminds me of that party game where the victim is sent outside the room, and when he comes in again, he has to guess what everyone else is thinking of. Everyone has agreed to think of Fluffy, the cat, which at the moment is in the neighbor's garden. The victim comes in and begins to guess. The others must only answer yes or no. If the victim is a good Aristotelian, and therefore no victim, the game could go pretty much as follows. Is it concrete? Yes. Mineral? No. Is it alive? Yes. Vegetable? No. Animal? Yes. Is it a bird? No. Is it a mammal? Yes. Is it the whole animal? Yes. Is it a cat? Yes. Is it fluffy? Yeah. Laughter. So Aristotle invented that game. We ought to give Plato the credit for having invented hide and seek. Democritus has already been credited with having invented Lego. Aristotle was a meticulous organizer who set out to clarify our concepts. In fact, he founded the science of logic. He demonstrated a number of laws governing conclusions or proofs that were valid. One example will suffice. If I first establish that all living creatures are mortal, first premise, and then establish that Hermes is a living creature, second premise, I can then elegantly conclude that Hermes is mortal. The example demonstrates that Aristotle's logic was based on the correlation of terms, in this case living creature and mortal. Even though one has to admit that the above conclusion is 100% valid, we may also add that it hardly tells us anything new. We already knew that Hermes was mortal. He is a dog, and all dogs are living creatures, which are mortal. Unlike the rock of Mount Everest. Certainly we knew that, Sophie. But the relationship between classes of things is not always so obvious. From time to time it can be necessary to clarify our concepts. For example, is it really possible that tiny little baby mice suckle just like lambs and piglets? Mice certainly do not lay eggs. When did I last see a mouse's egg? So they give birth to live young, just like pigs and sheep. But we call animals that bear live young mammals, and mammals are animals that feed on their mother's milk. So, we got there. We had the answer inside us, but we had to think it through. We forgot for the moment that mice really do suckle from their mother. Perhaps it was because we have never seen a baby mouse being suckled, for the simple reason that mice are rather shy of humans when they suckle their young. Nature scale. When Aristotle clears up in life, he first of all points out that everything in the natural world can be divided into two main categories. On the one hand, there are non-living things, such as stones, drops of water, or clumps of soil. These things have no potentiality for change. According to Aristotle, non-living things can only change through external influence. Only living things have the potentiality for change. Aristotle divides living things into two different categories. 1. comprises plants and the other creatures. Finally, these creatures can also be divided into two subcategories, namely animals and humans. You have to admit that Aristotle's categories are clear and simple. There is a decisive difference between a living and a non-living thing, for example a rose and a stone, just as there is a decisive difference between a plant and an animal, for example a rose and a horse. I would also claim that there definitely is a difference between a horse and a man. But what exactly does this difference consist of? Can you tell me that? Unfortunately, I do not have time to wait while you write the answer down and put it in a pink envelope with a lump of sugar, so I'll answer myself. When Aristotle divides natural phenomena into various categories, his criterion is the object's characteristics, or more specifically what it can do or what it does. All living things, plants, animals, humans, have the ability to absorb nourishment, to grow, and to propagate. All living creatures, animals, and humans, have in addition the ability to perceive the world around them and to move about. Moreover, all humans have the ability to think, or otherwise to order their perceptions into various categories and classes, so there are in reality no sharp boundaries in the natural world. We observe a gradual transition from simple growths to more complicated plants. From simple animals to more complicated animals. At the top of this scale is man, who according to Aristotle lives the whole life of nature. Man grows and absorbs nourishment like plants, he has feelings and the ability to move like animals, but he also has a specific characteristic peculiar to humans, and that is the ability to think rationally. Therefore, man has a spark of divine reason. Sophie. Yes, I did say divine. From time to time Aristotle reminds us that there must be a God who started all movement in the natural world. Therefore, God must be at the very top of nature's scale. Aristotle imagined the movement of the stars and the planets guiding all movement on Earth. But there had to be something causing the heavenly bodies to move. Aristotle called this the first mover, or God. The first mover is itself at rest, but it is the formal cause of the movement of the heavenly bodies, and thus of all movement in nature. Ethics. Let us go back to man, Sophie. According to Aristotle, man's form comprises a soul, which has a plant-like part, an animal part, and a rational part. And now he asks, how should we live? What does it require to live a good life? His answer, man can only achieve happiness by using all his abilities and capabilities. Aristotle held that there are three forms of happiness. The first form of happiness is a life of pleasure and enjoyment. The second form of happiness is a life as a free and responsible citizen. The third form of happiness is a life as thinker and philosopher. Aristotle then emphasized that all three criteria must be present at the same time for man to find happiness and fulfillment. He rejected all forms of imbalance. Had he lived today, he might have said that a person who only develops his body lives a life that is just as unbalanced as someone who only uses his head. Both extremes are an expression of a warped way of life. The same applies in human relationships, where Aristotle advocated the golden mean. We must be neither cowardly nor rash, but courageous. Too little courage is cowardice, too much is rashness, neither miserly nor extravagant but liberal, not liberal enough is miserly, too liberal is extravagant. The same goes for eating. It is dangerous to eat too little, but also dangerous to eat too much. The ethics of both Plato and Aristotle contain echoes of Greek medicine. Only by exercising balance and temperance will I achieve a happy or harmonious life. Politics. The undesirability of cultivating extremes is also expressed in Aristotle's view of society. He says that man is by nature a political animal. Without a society around us, we are not real people, he claimed. He pointed out that the family and the village satisfy our primary needs of food, warmth, marriage, and child rearing. But the highest form of human fellowship is only to be found in the state. This leads to the question of how the state should be organized. You remember Plato's philosophic state? Aristotle describes three good forms of constitution. One is monarchy, or kingship, which means there is only one head of state. For this type of constitution to be good, it must not degenerate into tyranny, that is, when one ruler governs the state to his own advantage. Another good form of constitution is aristocracy, in which there is a larger, or smaller group of rulers. This constitutional form must beware of degenerating into an oligarchy, when the government is run by a few people. An example of that would be a junta. The third good constitutional form is what Aristotle called polity, which means democracy. But this form also has its negative aspect. A democracy can quickly develop into mob rule. Even if the tyrannic Hitler had not become head of state in Germany, all the lesser Nazis could have formed a terrifying mob rule. Views on women. Finally, let us look at Aristotle's views on women. His was unfortunately not as uplifting as Plato's. Aristotle was more inclined to believe that women were incomplete in some way. A woman was an unfinished man. In reproduction, woman is passive and receptive, whilst man is active and productive, for the child inherits only the male characteristics, claimed Aristotle. He believed that all the child's characteristics lay complete in the male sperm. The woman was the soil, receiving and bringing forth the seed, whilst the man was the sower. Or, in Aristotelian language, the man provides the form and the woman contributes the substance. It is of course both astonishing and highly regrettable that an otherwise so intelligent man could be so wrong about the relationship of the sexes. But it demonstrates two things. First, that Aristotle could not have had much practical experience regarding the lives of women and children, and second, it shows how wrong things can go when men are allowed to reign supreme in the fields of philosophy and science. Aristotle's erroneous view of the sexes was doubly harmful, because it was his, rather than Plato's, view that held sway throughout the Middle Ages. The Church thus inherited a view of women that is entirely without foundation in the Bible. Jesus was certainly no woman hater. I'll say no more. But you will be hearing from me again. When Sophie had read the chapter on Aristotle 1.5 times, she returned it to the brown envelope and remained sitting, staring into space. She suddenly became aware of the mess surrounding her. Books and ring binders lay scattered on the floor. Socks and sweaters, tights and jeans hung half out of the closet. On the chair in front of the writing desk was a huge pile of dirty laundry. Sophie had an irresistible desire to clear up. The first thing she did was to pull all the clothes out of the closet and onto the floor. It was necessary to start all over. Then she began folding her things very neatly and stacking them all tidily on the shelves. The closet had 7 shelves. One was for underwear, one for socks and tights, and one for jeans. She gradually filled up each shelf. She never had any question about where to put anything. Dirty laundry went into a plastic bag she found on the bottom shelf. One thing she did have trouble with, a white knee-length stocking. The problem was that the other one of the pair was missing. What's more, it had never been Sophie's. She examined it carefully. There was nothing to identify the owner, but Sophie had a strong suspicion about who the owner was. She threw it up onto the top shelf to join the Lego, the video cassette, And the red silk scarf. Sophie turned her attention to the floor. She sorted books, ring binders, magazines, and posters, exactly as the philosophy teacher had described in the chapter on Aristotle. When she had done that, she made her bed and got started on her writing desk. The last thing she did was to gather all the pages on Aristotle into a neat pile. She fished out an empty ring binder and a hole punch, made holes in the pages, and clipped them into the ring binder. This also went onto the top shelf. Later on in the day she would have to bring in the cookie tin from the den. From now on things would be kept neat. And she didn't only mean in her room. After reading Aristotle, she realized it was just as important to keep her ideas orderly. She had reserved the top shelf of the closet especially for that kind of thing. It was the only place in the room that she did not yet have complete control over. There had been no sign of life from her mother for over 2 hours. Sophie went downstairs. Before she woke her mother up, she decided to feed her pets. She bent over the goldfish bowl in the kitchen. One of the fishes was black, one orange, and one red and white. This was why she called them Black Jack, Goldtop, and Red Riding Hood. As she sprinkled fish food into the water, she said, "You belong to nature's living creatures, you can absorb nourishment, you can grow and reproduce yourselves. More specifically, you belong to the animal kingdom. So you can move around and look out at the world. To be precise, you are fish, and you breathe through your gills and can swim back and forth in the waters of life." Sophie put the lid back on the fish food jar. She was quite satisfied with the way she had placed the goldfish in nature's scale, and she was especially pleased with the expression, "the waters of life." So now it was the budgerigars' turn. Sophie poured a little birdseed in their feeding cup and said, "Dear Smit and Smule, you have become dear little budgerigars, because you grew out of dear little budgerigar eggs, and because these eggs had the form of being budgerigars. Luckily you didn't grow into squawking parrots." Sophie then went into the large bathroom, where the sluggish tortoise lay in a big box. Every now and then when her mother showered, she yelled that she would kill it one day. But so far it had been an empty threat. Sophie took a lettuce leaf from a large jam jar and laid it in the box. "Dear Govinda," she said, "you are not one of the speediest animals, but you certainly are able to sense a tiny fraction of the great big world we live in. You'll have to content yourself with the fact that you are not the only one who can't exceed your own limits." Shuriken was probably out catching mice, that was a cat's nature, after all. Sophie crossed the living room toward her mother's bedroom. A vase of daffodils stood on the coffee table. It was as if the yellow blooms bowed respectfully as Sophie went by. She stopped for a moment and let her fingers gently brush their smooth heads. "You belong to the living part of nature too," she said. "Actually, you are quite privileged compared to the vase you are in, but unfortunately you are not able to appreciate it." Then Sophie tiptoed into her mother's bedroom. Although her mother was in a deep sleep, Sophie laid a hand on her forehead. "You are one of the luckiest ones," she said, "because you are not only alive like the lilies of the field, and you are not only a living creature like Shuriken or Govinda. You are a human, and therefore have the rare capacity of thought." "What on earth are you talking about, Sophie?" Her mother had woken up more quickly than usual. "I was just saying that you look like a lazy tortoise. I can otherwise inform you that I have tidied up my room with philosophic thoroughness." Her mother lifted her head. "I'll be right there," she said. "Will you put the coffee on?" Sophie did as she was asked, and they were soon sitting in the kitchen over coffee, juice, and chocolate. Suddenly Sophie said, "Have you ever wondered why we are alive, Mom?" "Oh, not again." "Yes, because now I know the answer. People live on this planet so that someone can go around giving names to everything. Is that right? I never thought of that. Then you have a big problem, because a human is a thinking animal. If you don't think, you're not really a human. Sophie. Imagine if there were only vegetables and animals, then there wouldn't have been anybody to tell the difference between cat and dog, or lily and gooseberry. Vegetables and animals are living too, but we are the only creatures that can categorize nature into different groups and classes. You really are the most peculiar girl I have ever had, said her mother. I should hope so, said Sophie. Everybody is more or less peculiar. I am a person, so I am more or less peculiar. You have only one girl, so I am the most peculiar. What I meant was that you scare the living daylights out of me with all that new talk. You are easily scared, then. Later that afternoon, Sophie went back to the den. She managed to smuggle the big cookie tin up to her room without her mother noticing. First, she put all the pages in the right order. Then she punched holes in them and put them in the ring binder, before the chapter on Aristotle. Finally she numbered each page in the top right-hand corner. There were in all over 50 pages. Sophie was in the process of compiling her own book on philosophy. It was not by her, but written especially for her. She had no time to do her homework for Monday. They were probably going to have a test in religious knowledge, but the teacher always said he valued personal commitment and valued judgments. Sophie felt she was beginning to have a certain basis for both. Hellenism. A spark from the fire. Although the philosophy teacher had begun sending his letters directly to the old hedge, Sophie nevertheless looked in the mailbox on Monday morning, more out of habit than anything else. It was empty, not surprisingly. She began to walk down Clover Close. Suddenly she noticed a photograph lying on the sidewalk. It was a picture of a white Jeep and a blue flag with the letters UN on it. Wasn't that the United Nations flag? Sophie turned the picture over and saw that it was a regular postcard. To Hilda Mahler Nag, care of Sophie Amundsen. It had a Norwegian stamp and was postmarked UN Battalion, Friday, June 15, 1990. June 15th. That was Sophie's birthday. The card read, Dear Hilda, I assume you are still celebrating your 15th birthday. Or is this the morning after? Anyway, it makes no difference to your present. In a sense, that will last a lifetime. But I'd like to wish you a happy birthday one more time. Perhaps you understand now why I send the cards to Sophie. I am sure she will pass them on to you. P.S. Mom said you had lost your wallet. I hereby promise to reimburse you the 150 crowns. You will probably be able to get another school ID before they close for the summer vacation. Love from Dad. Sophie stood glued to the spot. When was the previous card postmarked? She seemed to recall that the postcard of the beach was also postmarked June, even though it was a whole month off. She simply hadn't looked properly. She glanced at her watch and then ran back to the house. She would just have to be late for school today. Sophie let herself in and leaped upstairs to her room. She found the first postcard to Hilda under the red silk scarf. Yes. It was also postmarked June 15th. Sophie's birthday and the day before the summer vacation. Her mind was racing as she ran over to the supermarket to meet Joanna. Who was Hilda? How could her father as good as take it for granted that Sophie would find her? In any case, it was senseless of him to send Sophie the cards instead of sending them directly to his daughter. It could not possibly be because he didn't know his own daughter's address. Was it a practical joke? Was he trying to surprise his daughter on her birthday by getting a perfect stranger to play detective and mailman? Was that why she was being given a month's head start, and was using her as the go-between, a way of giving his daughter a new girlfriend as a birthday present? Could she be the present that would last a lifetime? If this joker really was in Lebanon, how had he gotten hold of Sophie's address? Also, Sophie and Hilda had at least two things in common. If Hilda's birthday was June 15th, they were both born on the same day. And they both had fathers who were on the other side of the globe. Sophie felt she was being drawn into an unnatural world. Maybe it was not so dumb after all to believe in fate. Still, she shouldn't be jumping to conclusions. It could all have a perfectly natural explanation. But how had Alberto Knox found Hilda's wallet when Hilda lived in Lillesand? Lillesand was hundreds of miles away. And why had Sophie found this postcard on her sidewalk? Did it fall out of the mailman's bag just as he got to Sophie's mailbox? If so, why should he drop this particular card? Are you completely insane? Joanna burst out when Sophie finally made it to the supermarket. Sorry. Joanna frowned at her severely, like a schoolteacher. You'd better have a good explanation. It has to do with the UN, said Sophie. I was detained by hostile troops in Lebanon. Sure. You're just in love. They ran to school as fast as their legs could carry them. The religious knowledge test that Sophie had not had time to prepare for was given out in the third period. The sheet read: Philosophy of Life and Tolerance. 1. Make a list of things we can know. Then make a list of things we can only believe. 2. Indicate some of the factors contributing to a person's philosophy of life. 3. What is meant by conscience? Do you think conscience is the same for everyone? 4. What is meant by priority of values? Sophie sat thinking for a long time before she started to write. Could she use any of the ideas she had learned from Alberto Knox? She was going to have to, because she had not opened her religious knowledge book for days. Once she began to write, the words simply flowed from her pen. She wrote that we know the moon is not made of green cheese, and that there are also craters on the dark side of the moon, that both Socrates and Jesus were sentenced to death, that everybody has to die sooner or later, that the great temples on the Acropolis were built after the Persian Wars in the 5th century BC, and that the most important oracle in ancient Greece was the oracle at Delphi. As examples of what we can only believe, Sophie mentioned the questions of whether or not there is life on other planets, whether God exists or not, whether there is life after death, and whether Jesus was the Son of God or merely a wise man. We can certainly not know where the world came from, she wrote, completing her list. The universe can be compared to a large rabbit pulled out of a top hat. Philosophers try to climb up one of the fine hairs of the rabbit's fur and stare straight into the eyes of the great magician. Whether they will ever succeed is an open question. But if each philosopher climbed onto another one's back, they would get even higher up in the rabbit's fur, and then, in my opinion, there would be some chance they would make it someday. P.S. In the Bible, there is something that could have been one of the fine hairs of the rabbit's fur. The hair was called the Tower of Babel, and it was destroyed because the magician didn't want the tiny human insects to crawl up that high out of the white rabbit he had just created. Then there was the next question: indicate some of the factors contributing to a person's philosophy of life. Upbringing and environment were important here. People living at the time of Plato had a different philosophy of life than many people have today, because they lived in a different age and a different environment. Another factor was the kind of experience people chose to get themselves. Common sense was not determined by environment. Everybody had that. Maybe one could compare environment and social situation with the conditions that existed deep down in Plato's cave. By using their intelligence, individuals can start to drag themselves up from the darkness, but a journey like that requires personal courage. Socrates is a good example of a person who managed to free himself from the prevailing views of his time by his own intelligence. Finally, she wrote, nowadays, people of many lands and cultures are being intermingled more and more. Christians, Muslims, and Buddhists may live in the same apartment building, in which case it is more important to accept each other's beliefs than to ask why everyone does not believe the same thing. Not bad, thought Sophie. She certainly felt she had covered some ground with what she had learned from her philosophy teacher, and she could always supplement it with a dash of her own common sense and what she might have read and heard elsewhere. She applied herself to the third question, what is meant by conscience? Do you think conscience is the same for everyone? This was something they had discussed a lot in class. Sophie wrote, conscience is people's ability to respond to right and wrong. My personal opinion is that everyone is endowed with this ability, so in other words, conscience is innate. Socrates would have said the same. But just what conscience dictates can vary a lot from one person to the next. One could say that the sophists had a point here. They thought that right and wrong is something mainly